Hello, welcome back. I am here again with Professor Larry Cotta-Backer, and we are here to discuss his book. We were discussing chapter 10, which was written August 13, 2019, Dividing the Baby and Killing It Too. Press briefing note from the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. How are you doing today, Professor Backer?
Oh, just fine. And I know that these videos will outlast us all, but I note that we are doing this on the eve of American Independence Day and a day or so after the commemorations of the handing over of the Hong Kong territory, and in the midst of the 100th anniversary celebrations of the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party. So all kinds of holidays around this particular chapter. But yeah, no, I'm doing well. Welcome everyone. And whichever of these events you celebrate, happy celebration.
Yeah, it's filling up the calendar right now. So this chapter was another short chapter, and it really talked about one issue. You talked about a release from the United Nations. First of all, interesting title. The first time I read it, I was like, what is he talking about? But
you're always saying that.
That is very true. Most of the time, I am questioning what you are talking and writing about. But when you read deeper into it, you do get a sense of where you're coming from. Um, I would like to just talk about the fine line that the High Commissioner is walking when speaking on this issue.
All right. Yeah. And for me, this is actually a very interesting chapter. It's very short, but it's very telling. And I didn't realize this at the time. I was more amused and cynically not surprised, but I didn't expect this to be as pivotal a moment discursively as it ultimately winds up being. Because what we see here, and I didn't know this now we're getting towards the middle of August, I didn't know this at the time, but in a sense, just as the central authorities in Beijing had already begun to develop their discursive approach to the quote unquote situation or problem in Hong Kong and began to elaborate it. And just as the Hong Kong academic community, we talked about one of its members a little later on, we'll talk about some of the others, have begun to mediate between that discursive trope and the values that they think were inherent in two systems and in their sense of the autonomy. The international community now steps in. We've seen condemnations by some of the major actors, and we've seen some discussion. But for me, this one really struck, and it struck because I thought it was probably the best, though quite succinct expression of where I thought the international community was going to have to be during, for what I thought was at this point, getting near the end of the crisis in Hong Kong. And of course, I was absolutely wrong. It wasn't anywhere near the end, but thinking, okay, so that's what they're doing. And dividing the baby, because of course, here the UN is torn. And the UN is torn in ways that I try to make clear in the chapter. On the one hand, it is, and especially the apparatus of the UN in Geneva, it is the central nodal point for the development, the global development of basic norms for human rights. And even though they were nudged a lot by the apparatus in New York, also a nodal point, more reluctantly, for general issues of sustainability and climate change, right? So this is where one worries about human rights, and human rights, not just from the Marxist-Leninist perspective, starting with economic, social, and cultural rights, but human rights with respect to civil and political rights, and importantly, because they had been a bastion for this over the course, certainly of the last 10 or 15 years, the right of political association. So there they are, and they're looking at this. And again, we're seeing in the protests of Hong Kong, even as they have been changing in character, the essence of that associative human rights in the bodies of the Hong Kong protesters on the street. There's no denying this, and that becomes a problem. At the same time, right, the UN apparatus is an apparatus subject to and an instrumentality of the collection or the collective of states. It is the expression of collective state action, and to some extent must remain loyal to, it must act in fidelity with the notion of state supremacy or state hegemony in the context of their sovereign authority over their territory in accordance with the rule of law and their own constitutional order. So there they sit. And so the question then is, so here you get the big human rights apparatus of the UN, the global authoritative expression of it, you know, and pause, there's a footnote that comes there that says, yeah, a lot of people get angry with them and there's a lot of fighting over, you know, whether they're doing it right or not, but everyone eventually looks there, whether you agree with what they're doing or not. All right, so here they are, and they're about to make their what I viewed as their first big expression. And what they wind up doing is, if you take the two parts of what they did and you sum them up, they sum up to zero. Actually, they sum up to slightly less than zero. And so that was actually the point here.
So did anyone leave this satisfied with what they heard coming from the commissioner?
Oh my God, no, I would not imagine so. I would not imagine, except maybe the commission, the high commissioner, and you know, and again, no blame here. Everyone tends to be, and in individuals, especially in international organizations, although I see it everywhere from the presidents of universities to elected officials, all individuals within these institutions tends to be prisoners of the logic of the institution in which they are situated. No more so in this case than the High Commissioner for Human Rights. She does not have that leeway, notwithstanding movies and heroic gestures and all of that stuff that we love to see on the big screen or on TV. No, everyone is really a prisoner of the logic of that institution. And this one is situated in a very, very tense way between the expressive protection of individual human dignity, including sustainability and climate change now, and the protection of the state system and its ordering on the basis of which that individual autonomy or the collective autonomy of individuals, right, can be protected. So there they sit, and there they have to do what they do. But in the process, of course, what winds up happening from my perspective is you manage just to make everyone mad. And you manage to make everyone mad because you give and you take away at the same time. And so the whole point of this was just very briefly to work through how this works out. And I do it by dividing the statement into several parts, right? There's the expression of concern part, which is at the beginning, a concern about ongoing events. Well, that is certainly going to some extent, is not going to annoy the central authorities, is going to annoy everyone. So they're concerned. Well, concern is a neutral term. I can be concerned because I don't like people on the street. I can be concerned because I don't like what the central authorities are permitting in the form of police reaction or police response. I can be concerned because I believe this whole thing is either showing the illegitimacy of the local government, or it's showing the kind of chaos that has to be prevented by more robust local government action, right? So I'm summing to zero here. It's not clear where they're going. But then what she does is she condemns the violence, right? She condemns violence. Most of that condemnation, right? And here we're looking at people on the street. There's no condemnation of discursive violence, right? Everything that's written is fair game. And that's essentially the big point out of this. You can be as mean, as aggressive, as whatever on paper. or with respect to or in or through the modalities of institutionalized rules and procedures, you just can't do it on the street. There's a footnote there, unless you're successful, right? But that's always the footnote. You can't do it on the street. And so here there's this condemnation. So she's looking at the expressive modalities of the people on the street, and she's condemning them because of the consequential violence of some of this. That's either deliberate or not deliberate. And then at the same time, she looks and says, but there's also violence on the part of the response, and we worry about that. And there we move from condemnation to something a little different, right? Because there we're not really condemning, we are worrying. What are we worrying about? We're urging, right? We're urging the local authorities here to investigate incidents for conformity, not to local standards, which is what the central authorities would have wanted, and indeed this would have annoyed them, but to conformity for international standards.
So this brings us back to chapter 2 in a way in which they are trying to bring them home.
Exactly. And so they're pulling out. And so that will infuriate the central authorities as well, because they have been arguing discursively, and certainly from the perspective of sovereignty enhancing discourse, well within their rights to say, no, our police response should be judged by, and in reference to the legitimate expectations within our domestic constitutional and legal orders. And she's saying, no, this is an international problem. We're going to condemn the violence on the part of the people, which is going to annoy the people on the street, because there's nothing there about concern about why it is that they're out on the street. There's just, you guys are bad, you're violent, and it ends. But with respect to the police action, she condemns, but here with lowercase, and then urges an investigation. There's no urging of self-reflection on the part of the mass of the people, urging of self-reflection. And then that which seems to concede authority to the central authorities is then yanked out by saying, oh no, it has to be done by reference to international standards. And so in the process, of course, in the process with due regard, because we're looking at international standards with due regard, not due regard under Chinese constitutional principles, but due regard under international standards for civil and political rights, including the rights of association. And so at the end of the day, what you wind up having is a statement that appears to concede to both, but in the process of conceding to both, might well have reduced the ability of this organ to be effective in its intervention. Worse, I think, are the consequences of all of this. And that is, in a sense, and I'm anticipating hopefully a question you might have asked, and then you can work around it or challenge them, but I'll do it very briefly. There's a sense here that what the international community is, in the form of this, of the High Commissioner statement, at this point, looking to adopt is a strategy that mimics the discursive strategy of the central authorities. That is, they're going to rely primarily on conceptual and discursive statements rather than anything else. This changes later on in 6 or 7 months. Sanctions, investigations by the Human Rights Council, blah, 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 any of the other more aggressive stuff. It's all discursive, the way we have seen right up until this point with respect to the central authorities, and that is this discursive development. But at the same time, by conceding that it's not the central authorities that are calling the normative shots, but the international community, they're just infuriating them, because that will wind up going back to and beginning to develop what the international community ultimately develops, which is this two-pronged conceptual strategy. First, that Hong Kong's two systems, part of the one country, two systems principle, is grounded, at least in part, in international norms and therefore subject to international oversight, right? And then the second one is that irrespective of that, international norms must apply, including international norms of self-determination, even if those norms of self-determination are understood and confined by and within the Chinese ultimate sovereignty over the territory. In the way, which is very easy for Europeans to understand, in the way, for example, although the Catalans don't like this, in the way in which Catalan sovereignty can be subsumed either within Spanish ultimate sovereignty or the fractured sovereignty between Spain and the EU, that kind of notion. And so that's what you get here. And at the same time, the protesters who are looking to rely on international bodies for more robust encouragement, direction, protection, get substantially nothing. Right, and so they're not going to be very happy at this point. And yet, I think from here, what we're going to see is the kernel of what the future holds for international intervention, a concession that the state drives this. And in this case, ultimately, the central authorities in Beijing, a chiding of the central authorities for not keeping their local authorities in check. That's the reference to the police action, which is ascribed to your underlings in Hong Kong rather than to anything that's going on in Beijing or under the direction of Beijing. And a sense that, well, within that, people, you ought to be able to have at least some kind of abstract support or derive abstract legitimacy from reliance on international norms within China. Right now, what that ultimately means may mean nothing.
Yeah.
Or it may provide a door opening for states seeking to advance their international responsibilities to then do something, either with respect to local authorities or with respect to the central authorities. We're just not sure.
The final question I would like to ask you is, the position given by the international community was disappointing to many of the protesters, or you presume it to be disappointing to many of the protesters. Do you think that there may have been a conscious decision to disappoint in order to maybe simmer down tensions and take away some of the hope so that it would diffuse the situation?
Oh my goodness, that's very naughty. That is a great question. The answer to which and I accept your invitation to connect this chapter to what we already discussed in the prior chapter, which is Professor Chen's notion of rational discourse right here. And that in effect, what they might have been doing was strategic in the sense that if you could simmer everything down, you can have rational conversations and there may be a give and take. That's possible. Okay. It's possible. I can't get into anyone's head here, but certainly it would not have been weirdly out of character to have sought to aim for that. The interesting thing, of course, is that if they were aiming for this, they did a half good job of it, because all they did was issue the statement without an invitation to either broker meetings or to facilitate or offer good offices of someone or other to facilitate more engaged discussion or to provide any kind of either roadmap or sense about how all of these things, once simmered, can be discussed. All we get is this. So it's much more tentative, but I take your point. It is possible that by simmering things down, you might have been able to get a little more flexibility. But at this point, the central authorities don't appear to be in the mood for any kind of flexibility, although they're one step removed. The local authorities probably at this point, like most of us, didn't think or thought that this was going to peter out. All they had to do was kind of just take a deep breath and outlast them. And so they may not have been in much of a mood to discuss. And given that, the constellation of protester groups might have felt that, in fact, this effort could well, from their perspective and looking for international support, backfire. So you get the intellectual elites in chapter 9 suggesting to the protester groups, including the elite members of these protester groups, that they're being irrational by looking for something like stability and prosperity other than that which was characterized by the central authorities. You get the international community saying, well, you know, go ahead and parade up and down the street, but don't be violent and don't expect very much more from us, other than we will berate the central and local authorities for deviations from some kind of international standard, which remains unspecified. The result, perhaps in the minds of people who have been, at least some groups of people who have been on the streets since the 9th of June, might well not have been what would have been intended or hoped for, either by the international authorities or by the central or local authorities.
All right. Well, thank you for answering my questions on this chapter. And I'm glad we have finally made it to double digits, and we're going to keep moving on this train.
That's right. And I hope our listeners are finding this of some interest and perhaps making the enriching what I hope will be their reading of the chapters once the book is released, or at least getting our potential readers more interested in the subject matter. So it's really a fascinating set of actions, and it's worth this kind of more granular looking at, more granular consideration as we move forward, understanding that by now international attention is focused now quite dramatically on the aftermath, sanctions, the collateral effects on trade, not just with the United States, but with the European Union increasingly, the recent content, the recent embedding of these reactions with other Chinese domestic policies in other regions within China, Chinese responses projecting out the same kind of conceptual issues with respect to everything from the state of race relations in the United States to their inability to deal equitably in some of their overseas engagements. So, you know, this is just, it's a marvelous base from which to begin to look at all of these things as well. But thank you again. Great conversation, mostly me talking. Sorry, we're going to get you to do a little bit more. And of course, you will be chatting about this at our launch event on the 13th of July. So for those of you, please, I will post to our blog at the end of the day. And it is on the publisher's website, Little Sur Press, registration information. I hope to see you all there.
I'm excited about it, and I look forward to seeing you as well. Well, I hope that you have a good day and a good 4th of July, and I will see you later.
Thank you.